Okay, it's very, very nice to see you all. Thank you very much for coming to this event on drug organised crime, financial flows and the impacts on climate governance. So a very warm welcome to all of you, and especially to those of you for whom how the climate emergency intersects with drug policy might be new. We're going to have this conversation in English, so if anyone needs translation, please sit next to somebody that can help you translate today, because there is no translation options in the UN today. So, my name is Clemmy James. I am an environmental campaigner that focuses on drug policy reform. I coordinate the International Coalition for Drug Policy Reform and Environmental Justice. Thank you for joining us on what we believe is a critical but often overlooked conversation at the CND. We are in a climate emergency. The climate and nature crisis will impact all aspects of our lives if it hasn't already begun. We should really be spending our time strengthening food security, ensuring that we all have access to clean water in the next 10 years, and thinking about ways of keeping trees standing. This is not an exaggeration. Instead, we are at the UN tweaking conventions of a failed war on drugs, a failed war on plants. The economic and political system of drug prohibition has created the perfect circumstances for the drugs trade to thrive. An economy that is unregulated, untaxed and profit-driven, with power and resources to undermine governance and governments around the world in regions that are critical to our climate future. So without further delay, I'm going to introduce our panellists, and once I've introduced them, they will speak one after another. So first of all, we're going to hear from Emma Mortensen, who is a criminologist at the University of Oslo, an advisor at Safe Youth Norway, and she is also responsible for making this panel happen.
Thank you.
Next, we will hear from Professor Simon Lewis, who is the Chair of Global Change Science at the University College London and the University of Leeds, and one of the world's leading experts on tropical forests and climate change. His work with colleagues in the tropics first showed that tropical forests are a globally significant carbon sink, absorbing carbon dioxide and substantially slowing the rate of climate change. He's also our first climate scientist at the CND. And it's the 69th CND. But finally, we've kidnapped a climate scientist, and he is with us and on board. Next, we will hear from Neil Woods, a former UK police officer and undercover drugs operative. Neil is also an international speaker for the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And finally, I will invite my colleague, Rebecca Lera, a Brazilian journalist and human rights activist. She has worked on social environmental issues since 1996 and on drug policy reform since 2008. She is the Latin American lead for the International Coalition on Drug Policy Reform and Environmental Justice. So in that, so we will now hear from Emma. Thanks.
Thank you, Clemmy.
In that order.
On behalf of Safer Youth Norway and the Norwegian Association for Safer Drug Policy, it's an honor to be hosting this event at CND. And thank you so much to our amazing panelists and for all of you who are here. So as Clemmy touched into, today's discussion is about connecting the dots. We often treat drug policy, organized crime, and climate governance as separate policy areas. But in fact, they are deeply connected. And I'm sure many of you are already aware of this. But in a broader sense, this still needs to be addressed, and it's urgent. Especially across parts of Latin America, illegal drug economies are closely linked to deforestation, land grabbing, violence against local communities, and the weakening of climate governance. These dynamics are not only environmental challenges, they are governance challenges. And importantly, they are also shaped by global economic systems and policy choices. When a highly profitable market is pushed into illegality, it doesn't disappear. Instead, it becomes controlled by organized criminal networks that operate outside legal governance structures and often in regions that are already environmentally and politically fragile. This has implications far beyond drug policy. It affects financial flows, accelerates corruption of public institutions, and therefore weakens the ability of governments to implement climate mitigation and adoption programs that are so desperately needed in these ecologically fragile regions. And this is also where the concept of climate justice becomes relevant. Climate justice disproportionately affects vulnerable communities, especially in the global south. At the same time, many of the policy frameworks and economic incentives that are shaping these dynamics originates in the global north. Countries like Norway and Germany have played an important and commendable role in international climate financing. They are both the largest contributors to the Amazon Fund, for example. And these initiatives demonstrate an important commitment from the global north to the unequal consequence on how climate change is geographically played out. However, while finance is important, discussions like today invite us to look at the broader system that perpetuates the climate crisis in the first place. Global drug policy frameworks, financial flows, and governance challenges interact with these climate efforts. If we want climate financing and environmental protection initiatives to succeed, it is now the time to join the dots and expose the economic and political systems that hinder the likelihood of protecting the most vulnerable people and landscapes in the current climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for highlighting the contradictions that we are now seeing, not only between the two UN spaces, the climate UN space and the drug policy UN space, but also how this money is moving around. Okay, we're now going to hear from Simon, who's going to zoom us out and explain the situation that we're currently in.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about 10 minutes on tropical forest and climate change, because much drug production is tropics focused, and tropical deforestation is the second largest set of carbon emissions after fossil fuel use, and about 50% of tropical deforestation is illegal and therefore bound up in corruption and these frontiers of deforestation. And also, for me personally, I'm normally at the climate convention talks, so I'd like to see how this convention is assisting or detracting from the climate convention. Next slide. So I want to kind of like really zoom out, because I don't think enough people appreciate the just wildness that is coming this century unless we centrally focus on resolving the climate change issue. So this is a graph of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere taken from ice core, bubbles in ice cores. So carbon dioxide is very well mixed in the atmosphere. And when these ices form, tiny little bubbles of air get trapped, and you can extract them, extract the amount of CO2 is in there, and then you can reconstruct the past. And people who look like us in this room emerged on Earth somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years ago. And then we've gone through these waves of high carbon dioxide concentrations and interglacials and glacial times at lower CO2 concentrations, ice ages. So between the high points and the low points, that's a completely transformed world. And we know that from the past. And spliced on the end is the direct measurements. We're currently at 425 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're already outside of the range of variability that all anatomically modern humans have ever experienced. And next slide. And this is what we're going to do this century. Somewhere in that blue part, we're already in a kind of super interglacial. And And we're just at the very beginning of those severe climate impacts as we change to something that has no analogue of anything we've experienced. Next slide. The number one driver of that is fossil fuel emissions. And we'll be at the bottom of that range if we curb fossil fuel emissions and get them down to zero. Next. And the second is tropical deforestation. That also is very important because you have to get emissions to zero to stop further climate impacts accruing. Next. And then the kind of less well-known, and part of where we sit in that blue arrow, will be the forcing that we do from all these emissions into the atmosphere. The land surface, the vegetation, and the oceans will respond to that. Currently, they really help us and slow the rate of climate change, but they might not do that, and that's where these idea of tipping points comes in. Next. And what happens, we have energy coming from the sun, it goes through the atmosphere and hits the land surface and bounces off, and these greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide, but also water vapor, methane, they trap some of that energy and rescatter it and make the earth warmer. And it doesn't seem like a huge amount to go up by 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels so far. But I just saw a list this morning of like 15 countries that have had severe flooding just within the last 2 weeks. And we're already seeing heat waves every European summer, Northern Hemisphere summer, and the reverse in the Southern Hemisphere. So these impacts are really starting to bite. Next. And I think the most important thing is that we are going to have to get emissions down, but we're also going to have to adapt to this new world that we are bringing into being. And what many of these like myriad impacts are, I think can be kind of reduced down to that each country and each city and each town and each village has a set of practices and cultural norms and ways of doing things that are specific to its place in the world, to its climate. But now it's to a climate that no longer exists. And that's moving further from that. So societies all have very, great tolerances. But when you have extremes outside of those tolerances or things that haven't really been experienced before, like new diseases, extreme heat, that group is not, town or village or country is not used to, then it can cause major problems. And these problems mount on top of each other as we go further from the conditions of the societies and how we've got used to doing things. Next. So this is probably the most complex figure in the talk, and I can only apologise for it. But it says a lot, right? So a gigaton is 1 billion tons, and on the left that's the amount of carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. And then we have a chunk coming from land use change, which is driven by tropical deforestation. And the thing we care about as humans is how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. And you'll see that not all of it, only roughly half goes into the atmosphere, and the rest is taken up by the oceans and by the land surface. And if we want that middle circle to get to zero and stop the climate impacts accumulating, then we need to get the fossil fuel emissions and the net land use change down to zero. Yeah? And then those indirect carbon fluxes, they will gently go back into equilibrium over decades. And what I think people don't really kind of grasp sometimes is that all the figures show that this net land use change, so you'll see these figures like 10% of global emissions is deforestation. And actually underneath that, that's the net deforestation emissions. We have is deforestation with a massive flux of carbon to the atmosphere, and then some places these forests recover. And it's the net of those. But if you think about 50%, and in some estimates 70% of deforestation is illegal, and we've got 15 billion tons of CO2, then perhaps 20% of the world's carbon emissions come from deforestation that itself is done illegally. So this whole point about crime and illegal economies, I think, fits right in with this point about deforestation being very important to control the climate impacts. Next. So thinking about deforestation, this is a map of tree cover extent by University of Maryland, a good colleague of mine. And then the next slides are just going to go through 20 years of deforestation in the tropics. You might depress it. Well, there we go. So you'll see these bright colours starting to. You might have to press. I don't know if you. Yeah. That's it. Starting to creep across the landscape. Right, it looks better on the screen, doesn't it?
Oh my God! Look at the Brazil.
Yeah.
So fucked up.
Press it again. There you go. So you see this spread of deforestation, and it's an enormous problem. And very important that we get a handle on it, not only for climate, but for biodiversity, for the livelihoods of all the people who are living there. And I just want to highlight two related to climate that we don't think about enough, that I think are very important, about rainfall recycling and local and regional cooling. Next. So the Amazon, the world's largest area of rainforest, has been experiencing drying over the last few decades. And there's a fear that at the southern edge, you might be approaching a tipping point where there's not enough rainfall to persist as a rainforest, so you might flip to a kind of savanna system. And then that itself might cause further drying, that then you see this rolling die-off of the Amazon going into the basin. Go back one. Rainfall, trees in a tropical forest, they recycle rainfall. So the rainfall comes down, it goes into the soil, and then it gets transpired back out by the trees, and then it can go back into the atmosphere and can fall down again. And in the Amazon, somewhere, depending on where you are, between 20 and 50% of the rainfall has already gone through a forest by the time it falls somewhere. So this is like brand new out, and it's trying to get a handle on how much of that is due to, how much of this drought and drying conditions is due to reduction in rainfall because it's from the climate system, and how much is the reduction of rainfall because of the impact of deforestation itself. And when he separated this out, on the left, it shows actually the climate system has been making the continent, the Amazon rainforest, particularly in the northern hemisphere, a bit wetter, which we might expect because like warmer atmosphere, more rainfall as possible, because a warmer air holds more water, more moisture. And then they separated out the recycled rainfall, and actually this strong drought in the southern part of the Amazon is predominantly driven by deforestation itself and the removal of this water recycling by the forest. And that means, so the good news is that now that is within the capabilities of those South American countries to stop that deforestation and do forest restoration, to regain the rainfall that they once had. It would be much more difficult if it was mostly from global climate change, because that's dependent on emissions from Europe, North America, China, and elsewhere. So it just shows how, for locally and regionally, the deforestation has massive impacts on the water cycle and rainfall, which is important for agriculture. And in Brazil, where you have these large hydroelectric dams, they are barely able to operate now in the dry season because there's not enough rainfall for them to produce electricity. So there's massive economic impacts from this on top. Next. And the final, when you deforest, you make the local area warmer. And this is from some colleagues of mine who calculated the warming from the deforestation that we saw earlier in the slides. And the deeper red is hotter conditions, solely due to the deforestation effect. Next. And there's a very good correlation, a grim correlation, but a good correlation between high air temperatures and human mortality. So you can then calculate from these increases in regional warming how many expected deaths there are from heat exhaustion and heat impacts on vulnerable people, the very young and the very old mostly, and those with disabilities, and about 28,000 deaths per year solely from tropical deforestation and the warming impacts on top of the global impacts of that next. And is exposing 345 million people to additional warming. So this deforestation is having local impacts and regional impacts, and I think that's very important because that's how you build constituencies and understanding how it impacts locally and why we need to tackle this climate problem next. No, that's it. And the last point I would make is that if Indigenous people and local communities are given access to land and title to land, they can control deforestation. And there's much more recent work, but I like this slide because you can see on the left where there's a kind of brown Indigenous reserve. It says KA for Kaipo and Z for Zingu. Indigenous reserve, and then you can see on the right, it's surrounded by fire, but there's very little fire in the Indigenous Peoples Reserve. So actually there are solutions to this if communities can be supported to maintain their lands, maintain their customary lands. So these are my concluding remarks. I'll just leave them up there so we can move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. That was very impressive and powerful and terrifying. I think what really comes to me is that what is required is climate resilient communities. Like, how are we going to encourage communities to be climate prepared? And what is unpaired? And what is undermining that climate preparedness? Climate preparedness requires strong, robust governance at local, national, and also international level. That means public institutions that have the capacity and resources to deliver programs on the ground to protect the most vulnerable. I'm now going to hand over to Neil, who can take us through what happens to those governance structures when you have an economy like the drug economy running through those territories.
Thanks, Clemmy. Just before I get to my main point, I just want to make a Norway-specific point, because I'll forget if I don't do it at the start. So in Norway in 2017, there was a shift in drug policy, and it was an important one because Norway adopted at least some harm reduction measures. Now, it wasn't as far as many of us had hoped, because we were hoping for full decriminalisation, but we'll take what we can get, right? But the reason I mention it is because at that point in time, up until that point, Norway was in complete lockstep with Swedish drug policy, absolutely the same. And there was a point in time where they separated in 2017. Harm reduction went one way, and Sweden doubled down on prohibition and had more enforcement, more aggressive enforcement. The reason I'm making that point is all of the crime-based measures of drug policy in Sweden have continued to get worse, and in Norway they've significantly improved. And those statistics have been in lockstep up until that point in time. So the reason I say that is because Rebecca will make reference to harm reduction. The headline is, harm reduction works. It's a philosophy that can be applied to any drug policy problem, however it intersects with anything else. I just thought I'd get that out first.
Thanks, Neil.
I'm looking at that map of where the most affected areas, and of course all of those areas across the equator, the most important parts that have been highlighted to us that need protecting, they're all the most important production and trafficking routes for the drug trade, as I'm sure everyone's already in the room's already spotted, being it being a room full of drug policy geeks. Now, now our comrades in the environmental activist sector, people who would normally speak alongside Simon, have for many years made some brilliant public messaging, and reinforce some public messaging that we'll all recognise. And perhaps the most important of those for us to discuss today is the fact that they have persistently and very efficiently called out the oil industry and the gas industry, the fossil fuel industry, for corrupting politics and slowing down what needs to be done for climate action. Now, they've done this persistently, and now we have some politicians even getting a fairly good cheap joke out of it. For example, Zach Polanski in the UK said to an audience just the other day, he said, I've never taken a money from any fossil fuel company, and the audience applauded him. And he says, it is terrifying that I'm actually getting applause for that. And he made a good point, but we're all aware of this, right? Our comrades have done a really good job in highlighting this. And it's an important point because that corruption has been slowing things down. But we are talking about legal industries where we do have some regulations, not enough regulations, not enough control, not enough state control, not enough, they're not being held to account enough, but they are being held to account to a degree. And there are regulatory mechanisms by which we can influence those big businesses. Now, the drug trade taken together is the 4th or 5th biggest business in the world. We are talking not quite as much in value as the oil industry, but it's not that far away. It's bigger than textiles, and we're a room wearing textiles. So that's how huge, to get an idea of it is. But the difference is that increases its value in terms of corruptibility is that lack of regulation. Even oil barons are being taxed to a degree. But
Not enough.
but the people earning the vast amounts of money from the drug trade are not being taxed. They're not being controlled. They're completely out of control. They can reinvest their money as they wish, and no one's looking at it. And we're looking the other way because we're told to look the other way. Because the messaging that supports, the political messaging that supports prohibition is that it works. And the proof of the state, the proof of police that it works is the size of the seizures, the numbers of arrests. And we are taught collectively as society to see this as evidence of success. It's not evidence of success, it's evidence of failure. Increasing seizures year after year are merely an indication of how the market is growing and the shape of that market in the way that it's growing. And in terms of the changing shape, this is important because the farce of celebrating these things as success is quite grim when you consider how much energy goes into this. The amount of money, the amount of resources that's actually spent by policing on prohibition is vast. But no matter how much energy policing is put into these markets, the size of the market remains the same. Or in fact, it doesn't. It's steadily growing. No police activity reduces the value in that market, the value of it. But all of that energy, that policing energy, state violence, if you like, has to have some kind of response. Every action has a reaction. So what is the police doing by that activity? If it's not reducing the size of the market, what is it doing? It's changing the shape of that market. And that changing shape is really important when we consider this intersection. Because one of the aspects of that changing shape, well, one of the aspects is an increase in violence. The use of police informants, for example, drives violence in the market. You create a gap in the market, that gap is fought over. It's the kingpin strategy that causes so much destruction. Violence is perpetuated. But that's not necessarily the most important point for this intersection that we're discussing today, because another way that the market changes is we've had a growth in monopolies. Now, if you have a growth in monopolies, it means that you have fewer actors having a larger share of the value of that market. And if you have a greater share of the value, then you also have more disposable income. And organised crime always invest their disposable income in corruption. Like always. It's the number one priority. Because corruption is what makes them safe. It's what makes them competitive. It's what allows them to get rid of competitors. It allows them to purchase law enforcement. And because there is more disposable income, and that disposable income has been growing, the expenditure on corruption has been growing, that means that organised crime don't need to corrupt an individual official or police officer anymore. They can go to a minister or a government. And that is what has been happening. Over the last 10 to 15 years, we've had the growth of narco-states. Now, many people dislike the phrase narco-state. It's stigmatising, but I think we need simple messaging here. Because many of our opposition, the opposition to what we are saying as a coalition, is that, well, the drug market is just like any other illicit economy. Illicit economies will always exist, and therefore organised crime will always exist. But it's not the same. It's not the same because the market dynamics are entirely different. And actually, as many crime monitoring agencies around the world note, including the National Crime Agency in the UK, is that the value from the illicit drug markets are routinely reinvested into other forms of criminality, other forms of organised criminality. And another way of phrasing that is that the value in the drug markets allow those other crimes to happen. They underpin them. So, if you do legally regulate and take those markets away from organised crime as best you can, you cripple organised crime twice. You take their business away from them, but you also take their ability to invest in other forms of criminality away from them as well. You cripple them twice. You beat them twice. And that's important because the other forms of organised criminality that we're talking about today are the ecological crimes, the deforestation. There are Albanians are stigmatised a great deal. British police actually refer to them as West Balkans now to try and avoid the stigma. But the truth is, it is Albanian gangsters who have been the most successful in shortening the supply routes. And what that means is that they are able to corrupt entire nation states. And one of the interesting, sinister facets of what they do is that they've purchased all of the wood trading companies in Ecuador, because it's easier to then launder the money through deforestation. And one of the most important ways that drugs organised crime launders money at the moment is through deforestation, because it's completely easy to hide wood and shift it on the wood markets. So it is absolutely in their interest to maintain climate destruction, because it's how they shift their money. I mean, organised crime are spread betters. They will use other techniques, but deforestation is incredibly important to them, as is the gold trade. Now, I've only got 45 seconds, so I'll just close.
You've got a bit more time.
All right. So just one last important point I want to make here is the fact that there's a startling fact that the Mexican cartels taken together have a bigger GDP than almost every single West African country. That gives us an idea of the financial power of organised crime and the fact that it's not even being monitored like our comrades monitor the oil industry. At the very least, we should try and monitor this, but better that we challenge it and change the policy so that it isn't possible. Now, those Mexican cartels with that vast financial power have corrupted those West African countries with the slave trade going across using Brazilian organised crime across the Atlantic into West Africa. And one of the key instances that's an example of their influence is back in 2021 when Guinea, for a very short time, had a democratic government. And as soon as they were elected in April of that year, they declared that they were going to fulfil their international obligation and stop deforestation. Up until that point...
Just geographically, Guinea is where a lot of the cocaine hits.
It's one of the most important... Guinea and Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, it's one of the most important trafficking routes across from with the cocaine trade. Cocaine. So it's very, very important to organised crime financially, very important, because it's easy to buy the governance there. They've bought the governance. So this democratic government decided to stop the deforestation, but in September that year there was a military coup which took over, and deforestation in Guinea went up to the fastest deforestation in the world instantly. Organised crime can buy the governance when it suits them, and they do. And this is happening in real time. Look at Ecuador. That is a decision by organised crime to destroy the democracy of Ecuador because it suits them financially. We need to be seeing this clear-eyed, and we need to be demanding legal regulation, not just for the sake of human rights and the lives of people who use drugs, as we traditionally campaign for, but also for the sake of the planet.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, it's a pleasure now to introduce Rebecca, and Rebecca is going to join these two huge areas together.
I'm going to stand up.
Through the viewpoint of Brazil. Thanks,
I talk
Rebecca.
a lot and I talk better when I stand up. So, hello, my name is Rebecca. I'm a Brazilian journalist and human rights activist, and as Clemi said, I've been working on social environmental issues and drug policy for a long time, so like my moment has come. And I just want to start with this very brief introduction that we, as the coalition, we see drug prohibition as a system of ecological harm. And I think it's important that we kick off framing it like that. And this is like a very nice text that we introduced in our last research, that over this last 100 years, this prohibition has established a very innovative, resilient, corrupt, extractivist, and transnational economic system. It needs to be addressed as an economic system that criminalizes plants of traditional use and people who use them, and ensuring that the violence and the ecological harm remain concentrated in a few territories like Latin America, while the profits of this trade move freely across international and transnational borders. It's a system that rewards logistical control, territorial monopoly everywhere, from the origin to the consumer market, and infrastructural camouflage, so corruption, while punishing transparency and community governance. So everything we need to solve the climate crisis, basically. And the intersectional effects of this combined crisis, the prohibition crisis and the climate crisis, they are disproportionately affecting specific regions in the world, and they are especially visible in my region in South America because of the concentration of the source of the coca and cocaine production chain. Different from heroin or cannabis, that you have it growing in several parts of the world. In summary, prohibition transformed coca, which is a sacred and traditional indigenous plant, into the raw material of a war economy that is bringing impacts to all over the world without ever reducing the use or production of cocaine. On the contrary, as we all here know, this market continues to break historic records year after year. The UNODC themselves are saying that. Next. So to zoom in on that, last year in November, ahead of the climate summit in Brazil, COP30, we launched this report, From Forest to Dust, trying to do like an initial assessment of the impacts and looking at it from a commodity chain perspective, and not only human rights, not only drug use, but also what actually happens since like every gram of cocaine, every crack rock was a coca bush in the Andes at the beginning. How this happens and what are the impacts across the territories. And this was done in collaboration with several partners from Brazil, Colombia, from the coalition. Tomorrow morning we have a specific session on this, so we'll have more time to explore, but I'll try to summarize the key findings for you now. Next. Why this mattered? I mean, my colleagues advanced, but we need to name prohibition as a climate crisis driver. It's not done yet. We need to expand the drug policy debate beyond drug use and beyond the criminal justice system to integrate territorial justice and climate adaptation. We need to remember that Brazil, please, like this morning in your panel, you were talking about the Albanian mafia, the Italian mafia, the Mexican cartels, the Colombian. What about the Brazilian mafia that is connecting the two continents, right? Let's please put Brazil also as a relevant country beyond Mexico, Colombia, And, you know, Ecuador, Brazil, man, it's big, it's important. It's also home to most of the Amazon rainforest, right? And it's where deforestation is really leading to the collapse on the hydrological systems and biodiversity integrity that our colleague Simon, welcome to our world, Simon, addressed. And we need a better analysis on organized crime, because when you generalize organized crime, you're not actually explaining. It's like a phenomenon that just out of nowhere, organized crime. No, there is like a system that allows these groups to thrive. And finally, we want to introduce the concept of ecological harm reduction. So learning from us, drug policy reformers and harm reduction workers, how can we bring that concept, that idea, to the entire production chain of these now prohibited plants? Next. So the first chapter of the research is the origins. It was written by David Restrepo, who is here from Colombia. And we basically, our thesis is that the repression in the producing countries, Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru, did not interrupt the supply chain for cocaine to the main markets. Instead, it fractured the command of this trade, and it was replaced by a model of parallel rural governance, where the cocaine economy is tied into territorial control. And that leads to a lot of conflicts and territorial violence against the communities that live in those areas. Today, all of coca and cocaine production is basically concentrated in the 3 countries of the Andean Amazon. And despite the continuous oppression and repression in those places, the productivity has increased from a family model to a now large agribusiness model, including the use of pesticides, machinery, increasing the risks and the environmental harms and the human rights violations of this industry. And it's, in those regions, it's also a direct driver of deforestation. So land used to grow coca destroys the forests. Next. Brazil. In the middle of the way, we have Brazil. And what we see in my country over the past 10 to 15 years is that the repression, especially in Colombia, created a balloon effect. We all know the balloon effect of prohibition, but in this case, it made part of the refining and industrialization part of this industry cross the border to Brazil. So we have increasingly more pasta base, cocaine base, entering the country to be industrialized there, used by the national retail market. Brazil is the 2nd largest consumer of cocaine and crack in the world, and became this main export route, especially to Europe. And that led to super incarceration in my country. We have almost 1 million people behind bars. 68% of women in jail in Brazil are incarcerated for drug-related offenses. We have a growing number of overdose cases for cocaine abuse without any policy to address those harms. And in the Brazilian Amazon region, we saw seizures tripling between 2019 and 2023 of cocaine base and cocaine powder. So, next. So this is a map that was done by our partner from Pará State, Instituto Mãe Crioula, which is led by Quilombola Afro-descendant people. And it kind of maps the routes through the Brazilian Amazon, but also through the Southeast, the other Brazilian biomes, the savannas, the Atlantic rainforest, the Pantanal wetlands, through West Africa or straight to Europe, but also from Colombia, Peru, Ecuador to North America via Central America. This is a very efficient transnational trade, right? This is big, yeah? Next. And just to zoom in the Brazilian Amazon, the Solimões River, the Amazon River, follows the main routes, but the repression on the main rivers made the trade go deeper into most remote forest communities and forest areas that were not touched by this trade until 5 to 10 years ago. So it's really happening very, very fast and creating havoc for indigenous communities and campesinos, riverine communities in my country. And as all of them mentioned, this is totally interconnected with land grabbing, illegal deforestation, gold mining, illegal logging, fishing, human trafficking, child abuse, and I can name like another 10 extractive industries that are profiting from this. Next. And then this was like something new that we tried to do in this research, was to map labs, refining labs. And with a very, like 3 months of research, we were able to find 550 labs operating in Brazil. And we know that only 10 to 20% of the drug trade, oh, Steve. Oh my God. Jesus Christ. Okay. Okay. Attention, please. Okay. You buy me a coffee afterwards. Okay. So we tried to do this first overview on this lab structure in Brazil, because we saw like the organized crime groups in Brazil getting stronger and stronger and going to like oil trade, buying land, building hotels, giving permits to build roads, airports. Like, how is this even happening? This. Because the added value in this part of the chain is huge, and this structure is controlled by fewer people than you have in the growing stage or in the retail market. So maybe we are talking about 20, 30 people controlling this structure across Brazil. And we estimate the total number could reach 5,000 in the whole country, because the police is not very efficient in Brazil, and there is not like an official database about this. So this is what we were able to find and to estimate. And then if you look at the numbers involved, the money, there is an estimate by the Brazilian Forum on Public Security that the cocaine industry generated around 65.7 billion US dollars in Brazil in 2024 alone, which is around 6% of Brazil's GDP. For you to have an idea, soya, which is the main commodity for export in Brazil, is 22%. So we have an illegal trade that's like a third of the largest commodity that we export. This, only the refining stage is around $6 billion a year, which is 5 times the total money for the Amazon Fund, which is Norway, France, Holland donates to, and is the main financial mechanism to curb deforestation and illegal deforestation in the country. So you can't compete with that. It's simple as that. Every euro you donate doesn't make any difference at the end. It's sad, but it's true. What can we do? Legalize. Okay, next. And now it's also a change, because usually cocaine in Europe came from different, like from Ecuador, from Colombia, but in the last few years, due to the structure, the infrastructure in Brazil, ports, airports, all these maritime routes, we have Brazil consolidated as the main export hub to the growing cocaine market in Europe. And we know that the Brazilian organized crime groups, in the chapter that Steve and Mary from Transform wrote for this research, they have become like international organizations, where they go and they get the pasta base in Colombia, process it in Brazil, and they run the logistics until it reaches the hands of the European Albanian mafias. So they are making the most money, because they are really the middleman of this international trade. So much money that they are building submarines to cross the Atlantic. And every other week you have now news of like the Spanish police raiding a submarine with like 2 tons of cocaine in Portugal, in Cyprus. Like, you have this happening a lot right now. Next. How much longer? Oh shit. And then if you look at the market here, you see that it's constantly growing, has more than doubled in 20 years. Cocaine used to be more inaccessible here in Europe, and now it's the second most consumed drug, just behind cannabis. And you have the street prices going down while the purity is going up. And that's also like a very efficient marketing strategy if you want to renew your consumer base, and they've been very successful in doing that. And the result is that cocaine is cheaper, purer, and more available than ever before in Europe. Next. And then I'm going to be very brief about this because Jenna Rose, our colleague from the coalition from New Zealand, is going to go into detail about what ecological harm reduction is. But this is this concept that we see that drug policy reform is climate policy. And to become that, we need to held the governments accountable for implementing drug policy that actually contributes to climate mitigation and territorial protection. We need regulation to mitigate the harms of this illicit trade, and we need to call on governments on their duty to protect the environment and the traditional communities, because we have all these governments going to the climate summits and saying, oh, we are donating, we are protecting, but they're sustaining prohibition at the same time. They don't talk to each other. Like the Norwegian Amazon Fund don't talk to the Norwegian drug policy, so there is a disconnect also there on that level. We need intersectional drug policy reform to address those production chains and the economic distortions that prohibition created and the corruption associated with that. So ecological harm reduction is about rethinking how we do that in a way that actually contributes to climate mitigation and community safety. Next. Also, just to mention that, we all know that the CND and it's totally in disconnect with other UN conventions, but when it comes to climate and biodiversity conventions, this disconnect is so visible and explicit. Many countries that sustain prohibition, they actually signed up for all of this. The Nagoya Protocol, the intellectual property treaties, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Treaty on Climate Change, but they're still signing up on prohibition. So it's like, I don't understand, next. So ecological harm reductions, we consider rights of nature, ecological rights, socio-economic justice, and oversight for legal drug markets so they don't get co-opted in a way that we have the timber markets or soy markets where they're still extremely destructive. We feel that we have an opportunity to influence regulation so that it actually becomes part of the solution also in those aspects and not only for consumers, for drug users, or for the criminal justice system. You can download the full report, please do. It was a lot of work to get this done. We have it in Portuguese, English, and Spanish. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you to all of our speakers. We have 5 minutes. There's so much to say. I hope that the dots have been connected and people have started to understand that there is an enormous contradiction between these two siloed areas of work, that we need to be bridging them, and we need to be thinking about how climate mitigation includes drug reform. We cannot be developing in the UNCCC, we can't be developing financial systems where the global north polluters give money to the global south while there are systems such as prohibition that undermine those governance, the ability to actually protect those communities. So we need system change as well as financial redistribution and reparations. And perhaps ending prohibition could be a climate reparation. So on that note, is there any questions in the room? John, and then if there's anyone, okay, we'll go with John first. Yes.
John Walsh with the Washington Office on Latin America. This was wonderful, historic in a sense, in a real sense, of Simon is here. So a question for you, Simon. How many of your colleagues, broadly, understand the role of prohibition in climate change and the need to end prohibition? And how can we make sure that that conversation is here and this conversation is there, broadly speaking?
10 out of 10 question.
Yeah. I think that very, very few people think about it in terms of in the climate science world. I think people are nervous about it because it's drugs. I think that funders and for scientists like NGO partners, they will often want to only portray things very positively about like what's the positive thing that can be done, and not think about organised crime or illegal deforestation. So I think there's pressures on people not to think about this, but it's essential that they do.
Yes, you had a question? Yeah.
Yes, my name is Farid. I'm Secretary General of Umbrella in Norway, and I'm very proud that one of our members is responsible for this item. And I think it's a very important link, and I completely concur with Simon's conclusion that is, as a former Green politician, actually, we don't see the connection in the environmental movement. But my intervention and question is, because I look at both the climate crisis and the prohibition crisis as that is economically driven. And in both cases, poor people are the ultimate victims always. And if we look at deforestation, again, poverty is a driving factor. And also Rebecca's presentation showed that it's an agricultural monopoly. You push out other agricultural approaches. So I don't have a solution, but my question is, like, how do we approach that? We need, like, how? Yes. Do you have any thoughts on that part? And I think it's very important to also, sorry, my English, to focus on that social dimension a little bit more as well.
Okay.
Because just the last 10 seconds, just saying legalizing it is not a guarantee that the root causes will be solved. Maybe it also marginalizes the already marginalized people.
Rebecca, do you want to take that question?
Well, yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer like very comprehensively, but we do believe that, you know, the plants that have been criminalized, they could be important regulated bioeconomies. I mean, the regulation of the coca leaf in a way that indigenous people, they have, you know, the indigenous governance is ahead of it, is on top of it.
Yes.
But it could become a model of sustainability for the countries of Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. And as a bioeconomy with a native plant, it would have, from the beginning, less environmental impacts than, let's say, gold mining, which is impossible to do in a sustainable way. So this is the kind of thought that we need to put into that. If you regulate the coca leaf in a way that's adequate to indigenous and other communities that live on it traditionally, that could bring territorial security, a source of income, economic opportunities for the youth, while offering also natural options that are not available. In Brazil, for instance, we have no access to coca leaf products, only to cocaine. And it's also the same for other markets for this substance. So we do need to talk about legalization, but not legalize cocaine to the retail market. We need to think about the regulation and the governance and the control for every part of this chain, and how we could make these bioeconomies as profitable or as economically sound and responsible as possible.
I'm just going to add something, which is that at the moment in legal regulation, the focus has primarily been the consumer. What we're doing in the coalition is that we're asking, what does harm reduction look like across the supply chain?
Yeah.
Not just for the consumer, but what would regulation look like if our starting point was ecology? If we looked at it as an ecosystem of people, land, water, soil, landscapes. And that is what we're trying to develop in the International Coalition for Drug Policy Reform and Environmental Justice. On that note, we are out of time.
They're not going to kick us out to the last meeting.
Great, let's keep going. Okay, so you've got a question?
Yeah, so there's ideology and then there's reality. I would love for all the drugs in the world to be illegal tomorrow, but it's hard enough to get governments to get rid of prohibition. But as you say, the demand's still there. It's not this people down on their luck that are consuming drugs, there's people that their favorite band's in town and they want to do some blow on the weekend. The demand's still going to be there. So it's going to be a huge leap asking governments not to get rid of prohibition. How realistically is to get rid of prohibition without legalizing the drugs? Because the demand will still be there, even if the prohibition's gone.
We would legalize the drugs.
Yeah.
We have, I'm saying that's not, you have to have a big buy-in from a lot of countries in places like China and Singapore are really going to buy in for getting rid of prohibition, definitely not legalization.
So what you're alluding to is the size of the struggle ahead of us.
Yeah.
I think within I think the movement has definitely been aware of that for some time. But the thing is, we have to push the Overton window. We have a duty to do so. We have to do what we can, and there are opportunities for change. You know, things are changing here. I know it's 10 years ago, but the UNGAS exit document did recommend that nation states experiment with regulation. We're allowed to experiment with regulation as nations, and if that happened have I got that wrong?
Yeah, it didn't recommend that.
No, all right.
But it's been recommended since by the other agencies.
Experiments are recommended somewhere.
Yeah.
Some document. I recommend experiments. But nation states can experiment, and we can encourage regulation, and it is happening. It's happening with cannabis, and it's happening with some aspects of legal coca in South America. So
Yeah.
And just quickly, the problem that is ahead of us is also the fact that we're disconnected as social movements. The largest social movement on our planet right now is the climate movement. It is not just scientists. It is children in the UK are taught climate science at 6 years old. So we also need to be strategic in our objectives as reformers of drug policy. We need to intersect this work with the climate movement, who has the ear to the public. We are still siloed. We are a satellite movement. So part of this work is also about making this a climate mitigation strategy to enable that this work is able to touch down in territories. Anne, and then...
Anne Fordham with the International Drug Policy Consortium. I just wanted to congratulate you guys, and I know how relentless your work has been to bring this topic here. I thought it was an amazing panel, really fascinating. I'm frustrated that we're sitting here in this tiny room and very few government officials are probably here to listen to this because they really do need to hear this. But also, as a long-standing veteran of the CND, as you all know, I wanted to give you sort of moral support in the sense that lots of conversations start in the tiniest rooms here and then we can elevate them into that big room. I suppose some food for thought and maybe how we can work together with you is how we get some member state champions to start raising this topic really in that room, and how we bring this conversation increasingly into the broader movement. And I'd be really excited to work with you guys on that. I'm really impressed. Really.
Thank you.
Do you want to come and work with us? Because I know you're leaving. IDPC. After IDPC, come and say.
I'm sorry, I have to run.
No,
Okay, thank you, Anne.
So it was a great panel, and your initiative is absolutely amazing. But I have a question from the, organizations working in peer work, like small organizations working with drug users. Do you see a place to get, maybe it's a stupid question, but I'm really tired, to get involved, a small organization of narcopolitics in different states to get involved in movement you started and you want to expand, because it's important and we have a connection with users, we have a connection with national organizations, for example, our national anti-addiction organization in Poland. So do you see a place for this kind of organizations in your movement for ecological change, or only this international organization with connection with governments?
No, we definitely see we need your input as well. And I think we certainly, the entry point for people understanding drugs and the environment is actually expanding in Europe, mainly because of water contamination. So how drug use is how that's playing out in Europe is really important. And I think working with harm reduction specialists that you take on this holistic approach. You look at how someone is housed, what they've eaten, how is their mental health. This holistic approach to the person is the type of methodology that we want to be applying to the supply chain. It hasn't really been done. This is an exciting area to work in. And so we need to be marrying those that are developing climate mitigation strategies. There is amazing work in the climate space on how to do coral gardening, how to keep, there's just such amazing work on climate mitigation. And there's amazing work on the harm reduction. And those two things are about reducing harm to the humans and to the planet. And we need to marry it in ecological harm reduction and develop a new methodology. We need you.
Can I add?
Yeah.
Can I just add, because I think like most drug policy debate, and it's very comfortable for governments and for prohibitionists in general to like, oh, this is a drug use problem. And the users, they feel this pressure, like we are guilty for this major violence and human rights violations crisis. And with this work, we show that the drug use is just the last part of this very long economic industrial production chain where a lot of people make a lot of money and they concentrate a lot of power, and they are to blame for the corruption, the climate crisis, and the governance crisis. And I think that's empowering to drug users everywhere, that they take a stand and they say, like, we are not the main, it's not about us. This is not about people that use drugs. This is about a market that has been sent into, like, to be clandestine, to be able to corrupt, and to allow these extractivist industries to thrive. And I think this, from a narrative perspective and from like a user's rights perspective, as a drug user, I feel empowered by this, right? That it's not on me. I'm not going to take the burden of this anymore. And we cannot let governments be comfortable on continuously blaming drug users for all this social tragedy that we are experiencing. So I invite drug users organizations to join this discussion because we need you as well. So thank you for your question, and please join the coalition. Everyone can join the coalition. We are super open. You don't have to pay, it's all volunteer. And we love like a good talk, as you can see.
Okay,
so
and you can all stay here till 6:30.
Sorry,
Hans
guys.
has a question.
Yeah, it's fascinating that we're here in this room, and I really loved your presentation, which was spot on and very clear, and I loved the intersection, and especially what Anne just said. Just an hour before this happened, there was in M7, there was somehow a similar meeting, but then from the UNODC and the human rights consultatives and some people from Brazil that had other data but said exactly the same in the end. They formed this new organization called CDESC. CDESC, I think you know them.
Yeah.
And that basically says the same, missing this one word. Legal regulation, etc. So they're more into social equity, diversion schemes, etc., but not on the regulation. So we have all these extra information, and UNODC is on our side without that one word. So I think we could be really close with that.
Yeah.
So
thank you.
Let's keep that.
Okay.
Please, we should go plan for the party.
Oh yes! Oh yes! Tomorrow night we are having a party outside of this building, and you're all invited. And it's at Fanina Live, which is a Colombian bar in Vienna, and we are inviting social movements from Vienna to come and learn about how these dots are joined. So while this is a meeting for not necessarily you guys, you are all invited, but really it's about making sure that we make this conversation accessible to non-high-level spaces as well.
And can I just add that the coalition has two guest NASA Nation elders. One is Fabiola Piñacue, who could not participate in this because there's no translation available in these spaces, it turns out. So she doesn't know that I'm talking about her right now, and probably tuned out a long time ago. But she and her colleague Luz Meri,
it's that one, yeah.
Luz Meri will be giving an induction into traditional cocoa products for sampling, and I think there's an opportunity to acquire. So definitely come and check that out. It's probably a once in a lifetime opportunity in Vienna.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
massive thanks to amazing panellists and our first climate scientist.
Seconds of your time. A lot of you have been taking photos, and we want the best ones for our social media accounts.